It's Christmas Eve, and Flight 2475 is preparing for its long journey, with the hum of holiday chatter filling the cabin as families, friends, and solo travelers make their way to their seats. The festive excitement is palpable as passengers exchange smiles and laughter, eagerly anticipating the holidays ahead. Among the sea of bright, cheerful faces, one stands out. A man with a weathered, weary appearance. His clothes are ragged and torn, his long beard tangled, and his face is marked by years of struggle and hardship. His movements are slow and deliberate as he carefully navigates the narrow aisle, trying to find an empty seat. He avoids eye contact with most passengers, his gaze focused on the floor as though trying to disappear into the background. Though the others are absorbed in the joy and anticipation of the holidays, a few notice him. They shift uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He's out of place here, among the well-dressed, well-off travelers heading home for the holidays. The man, a homeless veteran, doesn't seem to belong to this world of luxury and comfort. His torn coat and worn boots, the faint smell of years of hardship clinging to his skin, tell a story of a life lived on the streets. Yet, despite everything, there's a subtle glimmer in his eyes, a flicker of hope that this flight might be the start of something better, a chance at a fresh start, or perhaps a moment of peace he's been yearning for. As he approaches an empty seat near the back of the plane, he's careful not to draw too much attention to himself. He lowers himself slowly into the seat, the weight of the years on his body evident in his every movement. For a moment, he breathes deeply, feeling a slight sense of relief at finally sitting down, away from the cold of the outside world. But before he can settle in, the sound of footsteps approaching breaks the calm. Jessica, the flight attendant, notices the man from a distance. Her uniform is crisp, her posture rigid, and her face carries a stern expression that doesn't quite match the warmth of the holiday season. She glances at the man, her eyes narrowing as she makes her way toward him. Her voice, when she speaks, is sharp and direct. "Sir, you can't sit here," she says, the words cutting through the ambient noise of the cabin. The man looks up, startled by the sudden interruption. He hadn't expected to be noticed, let alone addressed in such a manner. "This area is reserved for first-class passengers. Please move to the front of the aircraft," with a quick, dismissive motion. The man's face falls, but he doesn't argue. He slowly stands up, his movements slow and stiff, as he gathers what little dignity he has left. He knows he's an inconvenience in this world, and the last thing he wants is to draw further attention to himself. As he makes his way toward the front of the plane, he can feel the eyes of the passengers on him, some curious, others disapproving. But just as he reaches the aisle near the front, a different voice interrupts the tension. It's a young woman, sitting in the row just ahead of him, who watches the exchange with growing unease. She looks up at Jessica, her expression softening with a hint of sympathy. She asks in a gentle voice, "Is there a way we can find him a better seat? Maybe someone could switch places with him?"
Jessica hesitates for a moment, her stern demeanor faltering. The Christmas spirit, though faint, stirs within her. She glances around, seeing the faces of the passengers nearby, some already whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. She sighs, her posture softening just a fraction, before responding, "I'll see what I can do." What do you have for? The homeless man stands frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The cabin, once filled with festive chatter, now seems to hold its breath, waiting to see how the situation will unfold. The man looks up, his weary eyes meeting the woman's gaze. A silent understanding passes between them, an acknowledgement of the shared humanity that sometimes gets lost in the chaos of the world. And in that moment, the true meaning of the season begins to reveal itself. Sometimes all it takes is a small act of kindness to change someone's life forever. The homeless veteran, whose name is Frank, doesn't immediately respond. His body, worn from years of struggle, seems heavy, as if the weight of his past is pressing down on him with every breath. He's been on the streets for longer than he cares to remember, surviving in a world that's often overlooked him. And now, even on a plane, it feels like he's invisible once more. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion and grief, scan the seat he had just tried to settle into. One last fleeting moment of peace. And then, with a shaky hand, he reaches for the small bag he carries, the only possession he holds dear. As his fingers brush the worn fabric of his belongings, the flight attendants begin to gather around him, exchanging awkward glances. They are clearly uncomfortable with his presence, unsure of how to handle the situation. Frank notices their discomfort, but doesn't respond. He's been the subject of judgment and disdain for so long that he has learned to shut out the world's harsh words and stares. Yet, in this moment, surrounded by well-dressed passengers and the festive hum of the season, he can't help but feel like an outsider. Again, Jessica, the flight attendant who had already addressed him earlier, approaches him once more. Her face is stern, her eyes hard with impatience. "You need to move," she says, her voice cold, lacking any warmth that might be expected on Christmas Eve. "This is a first-class area, and you don't belong here," she adds, her words sharp like a slap. It's clear she doesn't see the man sitting in front of her as someone who deserves respect or compassion. Frank, who has faced humiliation and rejection countless times throughout his life, feels the sting of her words. He slowly lifts his head, meeting her gaze. There's a tremor in his voice as he speaks, though he tries to steady it, willing himself not to break in front of her. "I've been through a lot," he says quietly, his words carrying the weight of years of hardship. "Just let me sit here for the flight. It's Christmas. I'm about to be with Christ. Wait." His voice becomes lighter, his head hitting the pillow. After a minute or two, and he slowly releases himself from the hood. Then sees Clara's eyes and sighs complacently and looks at Marianne to try to discern if he's looking at her and being familiar with who she is, or forget it. Maria looks away at him. The silence that follows is heavy, filled with the noise of the buzzing cabin that seems far away now. Jessica doesn't soften. Instead, her voice hardens further, each word measured and cold. "You have to move. We can't have you sitting here." The words feel final, as though she's made up her mind and there's no room for compassion or second chances. Frank's heart sinks, but he doesn't argue. His hands tremble as he gathers his few belongings, a crumpled coat, a small duffel bag, and stands up. His knees are weak, and for a moment, he wavers, his body betraying him. His hands clutch his bag tightly, knuckles white with the effort of holding on to something, anything, as the sting of rejection cuts deep. He looks around, briefly meeting the eyes of the passengers seated nearby. Some avoid his gaze entirely, while others glance at him with pity or disdain. Frank's face flushes, the familiar shame rising in his chest. He forces himself to look ahead, walking down the aisle with slow, deliberate steps. Each movement feels like a struggle, as though he's walking through a thick fog that refuses to lift. As he passes by rows of passengers, the tension in the air thickens. The festive energy of the cabin seems to fade, replaced by a palpable discomfort. Frank can hear whispers from some passengers, muffled conversations about him, whether they're about his appearance or his presence in the first-class area, he doesn't know. And in that moment, he doesn't care. He is just trying to make it through this. His shoulders are hunched as he walks, his back heavy with the weight of his journey, both physical and emotional. He reaches the back of the plane and sits down in a middle seat, further away from the front, where the rejection still lingers. Um, he pulls his coat tighter around him, trying to hide the tremors that rack his body, but the tears well up in his eyes, uninvited. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughs and the sounds of the holidays ring out, but for Frank, the Christmas spirit feels far away. The hum of the plane fills the silence, and as he stares out the small window, he's lost in thought, wondering, just for a fleeting moment, if there might be a chance for him too to find warmth and kindness on this long journey.
As Frank walks past the rows of seats, the eyes of the passengers shift toward him. Some glance at him briefly with pity, others avert their gaze in discomfort. The festive energy that had filled the cabin moments ago begins to fade, replaced by a palpable unease. For some, the sight of a homeless man in first class stirs confusion. Frank's ragged clothes and worn-out appearance starkly contrast with the luxury surrounding him. His steps are slow, heavy with the weight of his experiences, but as he moves toward the back of the plane, one passenger stands up. Near the middle of the cabin, Sarah, a woman in her early 30s, sits with her young son. Her face glows with the warmth of the holiday season, cheeks rosy with excitement and a soft smile as she listens to her son chatter about Christmas. But as she watches Frank being pushed aside by the flight attendants, something shifts within her. The sight of the man's weary eyes and the dismissive tone from the attendants stir her conscience. She's not sure why, but she feels compelled to act. Without a second thought, Sarah stands up, her body stepping into the aisle to block Jessica's path. "Excuse me," she says, her voice firm but calm. "That man has every right to be here." Her words break the silence, and the cabin feels as if time itself has paused. The flight attendants stop in their tracks, and passengers turn to observe the confrontation unfolding. Jessica blinks, surprised by the challenge. Her eyebrows furrow in annoyance. "Excuse me?" she responds, her voice thick with disbelief. "He can't sit here. This is first class. He doesn't belong here." A voice clicks in as the mistress of the vehicle says, "What will we do?" Sarah doesn't flinch. She takes a breath, her voice steady as she continues. "I'll pay for his seat," holding out her credit card. "Let him stay. It's Christmas." Her offer hangs in the air, and for a moment it feels like the entire cabin is holding its breath. Some passengers exchange uneasy glances. Others murmur in agreement. "She's right," one woman says quietly, her voice barely audible, but enough to reach the people around her. "He's a human being." Another passenger nods. "It's Christmas." The atmosphere shifts, the festive mood disrupted by the tension of the moment. Some passengers remain silent, uncomfortable, while others quietly support Sarah's stance. Jessica stands frozen for a moment, processing Sarah's words. Her gaze flickers to Frank, now seated at the back of the plane, looking defeated, and she senses a shift in the room. Her voice comes colder now, but there's uncertainty in it. "We can't just let anyone sit wherever they want," she says, her authority wavering. "It's against protocol." But Sarah's resolve is unwavering. "Sometimes doing what's right means bending the rules," she replies gently. "He's not just anyone. He's a man who's been through more than we can imagine. Let him have some dignity just for this flight." The words resonate with the passengers, who shift in their seats, some nodding in silent agreement. There's a shift in the cabin's energy, a growing sense of support for Sarah's actions, and for Frank, whose life has been marked by hardship. For the first time in a long while, Frank feels seen. A brief moment of humanity amid the cold indifference of his world. For Sarah, the answer is simple. It's Christmas, and Christmas is about compassion, kindness, and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Jessica hesitates, her gaze flicking between Sarah's unwavering stance and the growing murmurs of support from the surrounding passengers. The weight of the moment presses on her. She feels the tension in the air, the eyes of her fellow passengers now fixed on her every move, as if waiting for her to make the right decision. She's caught between her duty to enforce the airline's strict policies and the mounting pressure to do what feels morally right. The voices of support for Frank continue to rise, soft whispers blending into a chorus of quiet agreement. Sarah's words echo in her mind, piercing through the cold, professional demeanor she's tried to maintain. For a moment, Jessica stands frozen, her mind racing. She has always prided herself on doing things by the book, on following the rules, but this feels different. The holiday season is supposed to be about compassion, about understanding, and yet she's been tasked with turning away a man who has clearly suffered. Sarah's gaze is soft but firm, her words lingering in the air, urging Jessica to see beyond the rules and to the heart of the matter. Jessica takes a deep breath, her shoulders sagging slightly under the pressure. The weight of the decision pulls at her, but she knows what must be done. With a sharp sigh, she finally relents. "Fine," she snaps, her tone biting but resigned. "He can stay, but only because you're paying for it." Her words are a reluctant concession, but the moment she speaks them, the tension in the cabin shifts. The passengers seem to exhale collectively, the uneasy air replaced by a subtle sense of relief. Sarah nods, a quiet victory in her eyes, but there's no smugness, just quiet satisfaction that what's right has prevailed. Frank, who had been standing uncertainly, his heart racing in his chest, slowly makes his way back to his seat. His eyes are wide with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He can hardly process what just happened. His worn hands tremble as he sits down, the weight of the moment settling over him. For the first time in a long while, he feels a glimmer of hope, a fleeting sense of dignity returned. Jessica, on the other hand, walks away quickly, muttering something under her breath. The words are lost in the hum of the cabin, but it's clear that she's not pleased with the outcome. This wasn't the resolution she had envisioned. But it's done. She did what was required of her, though her discomfort is evident in the stiff way she moves. The cabin quiets again, the moment of confrontation now behind them. As Jessica disappears toward the front of the plane, Frank sinks into his seat, his weary eyes now softened with gratitude. Sarah, standing beside her son, watches him for a moment, her heart lightened by the small act of kindness that has rippled through the cabin. It may not have been easy, but it was the right thing to do. And for Sarah, that's what Christmas is truly about. As the flight progresses, an unexpected sense of calm settles over the cabin. The hum of the engines, the occasional rustle of passengers adjusting in their seats, everything seems to return to normal. Yet beneath the surface, there's an energy in the air, something subtle but powerful, as if the events that transpired earlier have shifted something in the atmosphere. Passengers settle into their routines, the festive chatter softening as people begin to doze or read. However, a quiet tension lingers, as if the plane is carrying more than just people. It's carrying the weight of the choices made, of the kindness extended, of the unexpected resolution that has yet to fully settle. Then, halfway through the flight, the mood changes again. The cabin shakes slightly, and the familiar seatbelt signs flash on. A low hum of discomfort spreads through the passengers, who instinctively grip their armrests. The occasional creak of the plane's frame and the soft rustle of seatbelts being fastened fills the cabin. It's only a few moments before the turbulence intensifies and the plane jolts, making some of the more anxious passengers gasp. The lights flicker for a moment, adding to the sense of unease. In the midst of this, Frank, who has been sitting quietly in his seat near the back, rises slowly. His movements are deliberate, as though the chaos of the storm has no hold over him. There's a calm in his demeanor that stands in stark contrast to the growing panic in the cabin. His military training, honed through years of experience in tense and dangerous situations, seems to kick in. Frank stands tall, his posture rigid and controlled as he makes his way to the cockpit door. The flight attendants, who are busy trying to reassure the passengers, glance at him in surprise. One of them moves to stop him, but hesitates when she sees the determination in his stride. There's something in the way he carries himself that commands respect. He reaches the cockpit door, knocking gently. Inside, the pilots, who have been aware of the growing turbulence, exchange a glance as they hear the knock. For a moment they hesitate. This is an unusual request after all. But then, the pilot closest to the door notices Frank's posture through the small window in the door. His eyes narrow in recognition. He's seen this kind of presence before. The bearing of someone who has faced the worst and lived to tell the tale. It's a military posture, strong and unwavering. They open the door and Frank steps inside. He doesn't waste any time. His voice is steady, calm. "I've been through worse than this," he says, his words carrying a quiet confidence that reassures the pilots immediately. They exchange a brief glance, surprised but relieved to have someone with experience aboard. With Frank now at the helm, so to speak, the turbulence becomes more violent, shaking the plane in unsettling ways. The passengers, already tense, grip their seats tighter as the plane dips and sways. But inside the cockpit, Frank takes his place, standing between the pilots, his steady hands moving with practiced precision. The pilots, who had been trying to keep the plane steady, now find themselves working in tandem with him. His movements are instinctual, his focus unshakable as he helps them stabilize the aircraft. The chaos of the storm outside intensifies, but Frank remains unbothered, his calmness cutting through the turbulence like a knife. The steady rhythm of his breathing, the confidence in his decisions, anchors the cockpit in a way that surprises even the experienced pilots. His years in the military have prepared him for moments like this, where calm thinking and a steady hand are the difference between control and panic. Outside, the turbulence seems to ebb and flow, but inside the cockpit, the situation begins to stabilize. The plane levels out, the shaking gradually ceasing. Frank, though exhausted from the intensity of the moment, remains calm, his face a mask of concentration. The pilots, visibly relieved, offer him a nod of gratitude. He doesn't seek any praise, simply nodding in return and stepping back to let them continue. As Frank exits the cockpit, the cabin has grown quieter. The turbulence has passed, but the passengers are still shaken, their nerves on edge. Some are still gripping their armrests, but there's a newfound respect in the air. When Frank returns to his seat, he's met with a few glances of admiration, but he doesn't acknowledge them. Instead, he quietly sits back down, his eyes scanning the cabin. The storm outside may have passed, but the real storm, the one that had been brewing in the hearts of the passengers, seems to have calmed. The passengers, many of whom had witnessed Frank's actions, now see him differently. It's as if the moment of crisis has redefined him in their eyes, not just as the homeless man who had been cast aside earlier, but as someone who has faced far greater challenges and survived. Someone whose strength lies not just in his body, but in his soul. And as the plane continues its course, there's a palpable shift in the cabin, as if the flight is no longer just a journey from one place to another, but a deeper journey, one that has touched the hearts of everyone aboard. With Frank's help, the flight crew manages to navigate through the worst of the turbulence. The pilots, initially startled by the unexpected intervention, find themselves guided by his calm presence. Frank's military training takes over as he helps the crew stabilize the plane, his hands steady, his mind focused. As the turbulence slowly subsides, a collective sigh of relief sweeps through the cabin. The passengers, who had been gripping their armrests with wide eyes and fearful hearts, begin to relax, their bodies slowly loosening from the tension that had gripped them moments before. First, the passengers remain unaware of Frank's heroic actions, too focused on their own relief to fully grasp what had just happened. But as the turbulence dies down and the flight continues smoothly, murmurs begin to rise. Whispers travel from one row to the next, each word a mix of awe and curiosity. "Did you see that? one passenger says to another, nodding toward the back of the plane where Frank had been seated. "He helped the pilots," another replies, a touch of admiration in their voice. "He didn't panic at all." Slowly, as more passengers turn their attention toward him, the realization sets in. Frank, the man who had been dismissed as nothing more than a homeless veteran just a few hours ago, had saved them all. The mood in the cabin begins to shift. The judgmental glances and whispered comments that had followed Frank when he first boarded the flight have been replaced with an undercurrent of respect. It's subtle at first, but it's undeniable. People begin to look at him differently, not as the ragged man who doesn't belong, but as someone who has experienced life's toughest battles and survived them. The whispers grow into quiet conversations as the passengers reflect on his actions, wondering what else he's been through in his life to shape him into the man they've just seen in action. Sarah, who had been the first to stand up for Frank, notices the change the most. She watches as people glance at him with newfound respect, some even offering him nods of gratitude. She feels a swell of pride in her chest, knowing that her instinct to defend him was not just a moral stand, but a recognition of the humanity that lay beneath his rough exterior. She can see how Frank's quiet strength has affected the mood of the cabin. The once festive atmosphere has transformed into one of contemplation and quiet admiration. It's a subtle shift, but it's powerful. Frank has become a symbol, not just of survival, but of the resilience of the human spirit. Jessica, on the other hand, is still processing what has just unfolded. She had been so sure of her position earlier, dismissing Frank without a second thought. But now, she stands in the aisle, her wide eyes reflecting the dawning realization of what she had missed. Her gaze keeps flicking toward Frank, her mind unable to fully reconcile the image of the man she had earlier ordered to move with the calm, composed figure who had just helped stabilize the flight. Her earlier coldness and dismissiveness seem like distant memories now, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of how wrong she had been. She watches as the other passengers look at Frank with newfound respect and gratitude, and she feels a pang of guilt. As the flight begins its descent toward the airport, the mood in the cabin has transformed completely. The tension that had plagued the earlier part of the flight has evaporated, replaced by a quiet sense of unity among the passengers. The landing is smooth, and as the plane touches down safely, a collective cheer ripples through the cabin. The passengers, who had been anxious and unsure just an hour before, now feel a sense of camaraderie, a shared relief that they had made it through together, and in no small part thanks to Frank. As the passengers disembark, they begin to stop by Frank's seat, offering him words of thanks and appreciation. Some simply nod in his direction, their eyes filled with silent gratitude. Others approach him more directly, their voices soft with respect. "Thank you for what you did," one man says, extending a hand. "I didn't realize who you were, but I do now." Frank, humbled but not seeking attention, offers a quiet nod of acknowledgement in return. He's not used to this kind of attention, but there's something comforting about it. The shame that had once clung to him, of his clothes, of his situation, of his past, seems to have lifted, replaced by a quiet dignity. Even Jessica, who had been the most adamant about Frank's removal earlier, approaches him as the last of the passengers begin to file out. Her steps are slow, measured, as if she's carefully considering every word before speaking. When she reaches him, she hesitates for a moment, her expression softening. "I'm sorry," she says. "I didn't understand. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. If anything—" Frank looks up at her, his tired eyes meeting hers. He can see the regret in her face, the acknowledgement of her earlier mistake. For a moment, he considers saying something about forgiveness, about the power of second chances, but instead, he simply nods. His words are few, but they carry weight. "It's all right," he says softly, his voice calm. "We all have our moments." With that, Jessica gives him a small, respectful nod before walking away. Frank watches her go, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The tension of the flight has long passed, but more importantly, he feels something else, something that had been missing for so long: recognition, respect, and a sense of belonging. The world, it seems, has changed just a little for him. And as the final passengers exit the plane, Frank stands up, his back straighter, his head held higher. For the first time in a long time, he feels like he belongs. Jessica, her voice softer than before, approaches Frank as he exits the plane. The bustling of passengers around them fades into the background, leaving only the hum of quiet reflections in the air. She hesitates for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of her earlier actions. As she steps closer, she can feel the intensity of the moment. Frank, despite his rugged appearance, carries himself with an inner strength that has become more apparent since his actions on the flight. "I'm sorry," Jessica says, her eyes filled with genuine remorse. She meets his gaze with vulnerability, something she hadn't shown him earlier. "I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. You're a hero." Frank's eyes flicker with something hard to describe, sadness perhaps, or a deep well of unspoken memories. His face softens slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Despite the hard years etched in his features, there's something serene about him in this moment, a man who has come to terms with his past and is no longer defined by it. "It's all right," he says, his voice carrying a quiet, grounded wisdom. "We all make mistakes, it's Christmas after all." His words, simple yet profound, seem to settle over Jessica like a blanket. She swallows the lump in her throat, surprised by the ease with which he forgives her. She nods, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her, mixed with a sense of shame. Frank's grace in this moment reminds her of something important, that kindness can be given freely and it costs nothing. It's a lesson she hadn't expected, but one she would carry with her from this day forward. The passengers who had witnessed the exchange between Jessica and Frank watch from a distance, some with softened eyes, others with a renewed sense of respect for the man who had once seemed out of place. The tension that had lingered throughout the flight is gone, replaced by a shared understanding of the power of redemption. People nod to him as they pass, offering murmurs of thanks or appreciation. They are no longer just passengers who shared a flight with Frank. They are witnesses to something transformative, something bigger than a moment of turbulence. The intro. Sarah, who had stood up for Frank earlier, watches the interaction with a smile on her face. She feels proud of both Frank and Jessica. She didn't expect this resolution, but she's glad it unfolded the way it did. She sees Frank in a new light now, not just as a man who helped them all survive a difficult flight, but as someone who has lived through far worse, yet remains humble and forgiving. She feels a sense of quiet victory, not for herself, but for the man who had been dismissed and looked down upon for so long. Her young son, who had been sitting quietly beside her through the entire exchange, looks up at his mother with innocent clarity. "That man is a hero, Mum," he says, his wide eyes filled with admiration. His voice is untainted by judgment or preconceived notions, simply the unfiltered truth of a child who sees things clearly, without the complexity of the world weighing him down. Sarah smiles warmly, touched by her son's innocence and wisdom. "Yes, he is," she agrees, her voice filled with quiet conviction. She places a hand on his shoulder, a soft affirmation of the lesson they had just witnessed. In that moment, she realizes how deeply this encounter will shape not only their understanding of others, but also their understanding of kindness and empathy. As the final passengers trickle off the plane, Frank takes one last look around. The flight, which had begun with judgment and discomfort, had ended with connection and respect. The faces that had once looked at him with pity now regard him with a new sense of dignity, and it feels, for the first time in years, that he has truly been seen, not as a homeless man or a veteran struggling to survive, but as a person who has fought through life's storms and still has the capacity for forgiveness and grace. Jessica watches as he walks toward the exit, her eyes following him with a mixture of admiration and guilt. She's come to understand something she hadn't before, that people's worth isn't defined by their circumstances, that true strength is not always visible, but often lies in the quietest, most unexpected places. And in that moment, she knows she will never forget the lesson Frank has taught her. As Frank disappears into the terminal, the final echoes of the holiday season settle over the passengers. It's Christmas, a time for reflection, compassion, and connection. The warmth of the season, the shared humanity that binds them all, lingers in the air long after the plane has landed. As Frank steps into the bustling terminal, the weight of the long flight finally begins to lift from his shoulders. The usual clatter of travelers, the distant hum of conversations, and the comforting whir of luggage carts fills the air. Yet, something feels different about today. A quiet sense of anticipation hums just beneath the surface, as if the world has conspired to offer him one last chance at redemption. As he makes his way toward the exit, lost in thought, a voice calls out to him. "Excuse me," a man says, his voice polite but urgent. Frank turns to see a man in a sharp business suit approaching him, holding a phone in one hand. The man's expression is sincere, and there's something about him that immediately puts Frank at ease, though he doesn't know why. "It is easy. I'm a representative from a charity that helps veterans," the man continues. "We've been tracking your story. We know what you've been through. We've been waiting for the right moment to reach out to you. You've got a place to stay tonight, and we'd like to offer you some support." Frank stands frozen for a moment, trying to process what he's hearing. His mind races, but his body seems to move on its own. He takes a tentative step forward, unsure whether this is a dream or something real. The man hands him the phone, and Frank, still dazed, takes it in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "Frank," a voice on the other end says, its tone warm but firm, as if it's been waiting for this moment for a long time. "We've been following your story. We know your struggle. We've got a job for you, a real opportunity. We'd like to give you the chance to start over." Frank's breath catches in his throat. His chest tightens, and for a moment, he can hardly comprehend the words. A job. An opportunity to start over. It's been so long since anyone offered him a real chance, and the possibility of it seems too much to bear. His heart begins to race, but the words of the voice on the phone continue, steady and reassuring. "We've set up a place for you, and we'll make sure you have everything you need. This is your chance, Frank. You're not alone anymore." The floodgates open. Frank's eyes sting with the sudden rush of emotion. Years of struggle, isolation and despair breaking free all at once. For the first time in years, he feels something he hasn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. A small but undeniable flicker of possibility stirs inside him, like the soft glow of a distant star cutting through the darkness. As he lowers the phone from his ear, he looks up at the man who has been standing beside him, watching him with quiet understanding. Frank's voice cracks when he finally speaks. "Thank you," he whispers, his voice full of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you so much." The man smiles, his eyes kind and knowing. "This is just the beginning, Frank. There are good people out there. You just need to trust in the possibility of change." He nods, his heart swelling with emotions he can hardly put into words. As he hangs up the phone and hands it back, he takes a deep breath. He looks around the terminal, his eyes scanning the familiar but now foreign surroundings. The once overlooked details, the soft hum of the lights, the bustling energy of the travelers, now seem to pulse with possibility. He steps outside, the crisp winter air greeting him like an old friend. The city around him is aglow with the soft, shimmering lights of Christmas. The festive colors reflecting off the glass of nearby buildings and casting a gentle golden glow over the street. For the first time in a long time, Frank feels a sense of peace. The weight of the world, though not entirely gone, seems lighter now. The promise of something new, something real, has taken root in his heart. As he walks down the street, the snow begins to fall, the soft flakes catching the light in a way that feels almost magical. Frank watches them for a moment, each flake drifting slowly down before vanishing in the warmth of the earth. He inhales deeply, a sense of quiet gratitude washing over him. This Christmas, everything has changed. The hope that had seemed so far out of reach just days ago is now within his grasp. The kindness of strangers, the support of a few good people, and the spirit of the season have come together to offer him a new beginning. As he walks down the street, Frank feels something he hasn't felt in years. Alive. And for the first time in a long while, he's ready to embrace whatever comes next. The future, once shrouded in uncertainty, now gleams with the potential for transformation. This Christmas, Frank's story is just beginning.